Check, check. Oh, that's on.
Where is Ayşe? I don't see her.
We're probably going to get like a green light from someone. Oh, there she is. She's right in the back.
Okay. I'll get a check from her.
Okay. All right. Go. All right. We're going. Welcome, or welcome back to the Last Frontier. We're grateful that you have come from near and far to make this meeting what it is. While you are here, we hope you get a sense of the vastness of this state and land, as well as its opportunities for everyone, and especially for earthquake scientists. Alaska's most recent earthquake was 6 minutes ago. That's a fact. I'm Carl Tape. It's been an honor to co-chair this meeting with Mike West. Mike is a friend and colleague at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's the director of the Alaska Earthquake Center. Alaska has a rich cultural history. That history is reflected in the names of our meeting rooms and the art that fills this center. I encourage you to learn more by visiting the nearby Alaska Native Heritage Center and the Anchorage Museum. Alaska's history also includes many notable earthquakes. Many among the public think of California as the seismic center of the US. It was the 1906 San Francisco quake that inspired SSA's founding. This is an old organization. But within our crowd, we know that Alaska is by far the most seismically active state in the country. Thankfully, we have an outstanding legislative partner here who understands just how critically important it is to be prepared for earthquakes and other major seismic events. And I'm talking about U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski. And that, by here, I mean here by video. So just to, Senator Murkowski has long championed hazards legislation for Alaska and the entire nation, from the reauthorization of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, which she co-introduced again this year, to the Landslides Preparedness Reauthorization Act, also introduced this year, to the National Volcano Early Warning System Reauthorization, which she helped pass. Senator Murkowski understands both the value of geoscience itself and the geoscientists who contribute to creating a more disaster-resilient nation. She's a great ally, and I'm happy to share this special message she recorded for each of you.
Well, hello to all of you attending this annual meeting, and for those of you who are visiting Alaska, welcome. It's great to have you there. And it's really great to have the conference being held in Anchorage. Hope you're enjoying your time in our nation's most seismically active state. I'd like to start by acknowledging Carl Tape and Michael West of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I want to thank you. Thank you for serving as program co-chairs, bringing this important conversation to our state, and really for all that you do in this space. As you all know, earthquakes are not an abstract phenomenon for Alaskans. They're really a fact of life. We get used to them. We've been through more earthquakes than we can care to admit. Some of them, like the 1964 earthquake and the tsunami that followed, are simply unforgettable because of their devastation, even 60 years later. Our Good Friday earthquake was a major disaster, but it also became a testament to our ability to work together to rebuild resilient communities. Some, like Valdez, made bold decisions to relocate to safer ground. Seward repurposed vulnerable waterfront areas into campgrounds. And within a decade, we embarked on the construction of an 800-mile oil pipeline incorporating the latest in scientific and engineering advancements to withstand significant seismic activity. Believe me, that pipeline has been tested, and we got it right. And thank goodness that we did. And to give credit where it is due, this progress would not have been possible without organizations like the Seismological Society of America. Your research and expertise have been instrumental in helping us navigate and mitigate the risks posed by natural hazards. Now, I've also benefited from your work as I push my congressional colleagues to support legislation focused on earthquakes and tsunamis, volcanoes, and landslides. Many of you there helped us craft legislation on those hazards, and then you helped us build support as we advanced those bills into law. And with each major event that we see, we learn invaluable lessons, insights from the earthquakes in '64, and then more recently, the big one that we had in 2018, have allowed us really to identify similar hazards lurking in the Pacific Northwest and in other areas. And as our understanding evolves, so must our national programs. Today, some of this is due to rising threats. Climate change is driving an uptick in large coastal landslides. And some of it is us trying to capitalize on the technology that's available. As we become increasingly interconnected, we can build out our earthquake early warning systems. And while we're still working to implement those in Alaska, the progress that USGS has made in California, Oregon, and Washington is very impressive. So as you all meet this week, know that I'm proud to be your legislative partner with reauthorization bills focused on earthquakes and landslides already introduced in the Senate, and bills focused on tsunamis and volcanoes that are next on my list. I recognize I can't do this without you. It's just not possible. Because you're not just scientists. You help safeguard our communities and our people. You help us understand hazards and warn of impending danger. And in Anchorage, you're in a city and a state that really underscore the urgency of that mission. So know that we get it. So thank you for what you do. Keep in touch with my office. Let us know what we can do to help you. And may your efforts continue to make Alaska and our nation safer and more resilient. Thank you and take care.
All right, I hope those words will inspire and motivate us here through sessions in the days to come. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Ayşe Hortaçsu, who is the Director of Projects at the Applied Technology Council. In that role, she's led tremendously important work both in the US and abroad, doing post-earthquake safety evaluations, performance assessments of buildings and seismic retrofits. She served as director on the board of the Structural Engineers Association of Northern California. In that role, she's done a lot of things, but she helped establish, among these, the Structural Engineering Equity and Engagement Committee. She also launched Women in Structural Engineering to help link women working in the field. She's a really active member of our sister organization, the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, and in that role, she's received accolades for her work, most notably as a member of its Learning from Earthquakes team. And it is experiences from that she will be presenting this evening. As a side note, I learned in talking with Ayşe that she became a member of SSA just last year. Ayşe, you are now giving the opening plenary remarks to kick off this meeting. On this trajectory, I think we're expecting you to serve as president a year or so from now. So it is my great honor to welcome Ayşe Hortaçsu up to the SSA stage. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me today. And I had the pleasure of meeting.
Maybe just pull this forward. Oops, sorry. Maybe just like 6 inches.
I had the pleasure of meeting many of you in the Prince William Sound yesterday. So again, my first meeting at SSA is going quite well, I would say. So thank you for welcoming me. As Mike said in my introduction, I am a structural engineer, and I'm here to share with you observations from my observations from the field and the structural engineering office. That is the basis of the information I'm going to share today. But what I really want to emphasize in my talk is how we are going to learn from these observations. Because observing, collecting information is exciting, it's one thing. We write papers, we talk amongst each other, but what really matters is what we do with that knowledge. Do we create change? Do we change how we model? Do we change how we design buildings? Do we change where we put our money? Is it the granite countertops versus a seismic retrofit? So what is really important is for us to now, 15 months after this terrible disaster, is not forget, we have to learn from it, but not only technically, but we also have to think about how we can continue improving and creating a more resilient society. So with that, the first thing I want to touch on is that earthquakes are really, really personal. And I'm here because of an earthquake. Back in 1999, I was an undeclared engineering student at Stanford University, studying. I'm taking everything 101, mechanical engineering, material science, computer science, trying to figure out, which one's really going to work for me. And then the 99 earthquake in Kocaeli happened, really, really close to my hometown of Istanbul. The official death toll at the time was 17,000, unofficial was 50. And I had the opportunity to tag along with some Bay Area engineers, act as their translator on the field, talk to people in their villages and damaged buildings, and see the devastation in person. And I said, okay, apparently I can do engineering. Let me do it in a way that I can really make an impact. In 25 years, I will have this solved. Well, unfortunately, here we are, 25 years later. Obviously, some things have not changed enough. But again, I'm really, really motivated for all of this because earthquakes are personal. So here we are sitting in beautiful Alaska, literally, I think as far as we can be from Turkey. And I really, really appreciate you paying attention to this faraway earthquake still. And besides the Turkey earthquakes, since February 2023, there have been many large earthquakes, even the great earthquake of New Jersey. And I want to start my talk with a quote about Taiwan. Of course, now it's too small and I can't see it. But the title is Why Taiwan Was So Prepared for a Powerful Earthquake. As you might recall, in 1999, same year as Kocaeli, they had a major earthquake too, and thousands of people died. But since then, they have really learned a lesson. They have started enforcing building codes, they have applied their research, and because of that, only 9 or 10 people lost their lives in this major earthquakes. So now, let's come back to Turkey. As Mike mentioned, I had the privilege of going to the earthquake area as a member of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute's Learning from Earthquakes program as part of the advanced team. And this was within 6 to 7 days after the earthquake. And what we did was we collected information, fed it back to HQ, and they were able to send about 30 other team members with more focused areas to study the damage on the field. And all of this information is compiled on the Learning from Earthquakes website of EERI. And there's been a lot of publications about the earthquake since, so a lot of information on this presentation comes from, again, things I observed, but that was literally February 2023, but also kind of monitoring all of the information that has been made available since. There's been a lot of reports coming from Turkish universities, a lot of the NSF-founded centers like STEER and GEAR issued reports. There was an official government report, so a lot of the numbers I'm going to quote today come from that official report that was published within 1 month after the earthquake. As well as EERI had a collection of papers published, so instead of a Spectra journal special issue, we've been collecting papers on the topic. So there's a lot of great information, a lot of good scientific information in there. So Turkey is a place where, for thousands of years, cultures, histories, and people have been coming together. It's also where plates come together. And when plates come together, you guys know better than me, there's a lot of earthquakes. So this is a chart showing historical seismicity larger than 5.5 since 1900. So there's a lot of earthquakes. And because of that, there's the seismic hazard of Turkey is quite well known. And about 95% of the country has some kind of seismic hazard. So the two stars you see are the epicenters of the two major events. The first one, the lower one, occurred at 4 in the morning, and then 9 hours later was a 7.4. So the second earthquake was triggered by the first one. Because the earthquake seismic hazard in Turkey is so well known, the area was very well instrumented, and there were 280 recording stations. So where's the data? Of course, the AFAD, the Turkish Emergency Management Agency, they made the data available, as well as DesignSafe has the set of data available for download as well. So this might be of interest to you. Okay, quick overview. What happened? With the two earthquakes, the official numbers are over 50,000 casualties, over 100,000 people gravely injured, $100 billion of damage, and this is for a country that was already struggling with its economy. And about 200,000 buildings were severely damaged, either collapsed, had to be demolished. So this affected about a quarter of the population of the country, because the earthquake area was quite broad. So over just the surface structure was about 500 kilometers, right? So it affected 14 million people. And there was a lot of buildings lost. So my team, when we were on the ground, I was actually with two teams. We visited, we drove about 1,000 kilometers, visited about 11 of the cities. And because this was so soon after the earthquake, we were supported by the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Learning from Earthquakes team back home, located in California and Chile, looking at the shake map, telling us where the station is from a satellite map, and actually also pulling all of these really helpful newfangled technologies that came about in the last couple of years. The satellite imagery of a lot of different satellite companies were putting out damage assessments. So we were able to tell our driver, go to this area, we want to see the damage, or sometimes we don't want to see the damage, right? So we were able to navigate this way. So a little bit of structural engineering talk for you, and this is because I think this will be helpful so that you can, I'm going to talk about building performance and recovery, and the seismology, of course, is the input to that. So I think it'll be really important to understand it all. So the typical construction in Turkey looks quite different than here. It's concrete frames, and they really like using unreinforced masonry partition walls. And one of the interesting data that the follow-on ERI team collected was that they actually looked at 91 buildings that weren't collapsed. These were primarily modern buildings, and they said, okay, what are the primary reasons that they were damaged? And the higher bars you see there are rebar buckling, concrete crushing, plastic hinging. These are actually all indications of not enough reinforcement in the reinforced concrete that they were building this building with. So keep that in mind. There was not enough reinforcement in buildings post-2000. It's going to come back up later. Here's a couple pictures of what that looks like on the field. The yellow picture there, there's a big Y on it. That building's standing. Not bad? Oh, it is bad. The Y is for yıkmak. That's a demolition order. So all of the columns, as you can see there, have hinged at the bottom. You cannot repair that building, so that building has to be demolished. The building on the top is a school building that squashed one floor. Good news, that is actually the only school building that we saw with damage. There were very few school buildings that were damaged in general. And then the building in the middle, especially for structural engineers, that's a really typical, almost caricature-like picture of a soft story failure. The first story was taller than the rest, but it wasn't strong enough to support all the weight that was sloshing above, so it just leaned a little bit. This is a favorite of the geotechs. This is a picture where it's a favorite picture of structural engineers. This is where the structural engineer did their job, but the geotech didn't. And this happens to happen in a town called Gölbaşı, where göl means lake, and başı means the side of. So this this is clearly a liquefiable soil that they didn't do the proper work to put proper foundations, and the buildings simply tipped over. Luckily, they were able to get the occupants out. You can kind of see, hammer marks just up there where the neighbors pried people out of their bathrooms. So now we're going to focus on one city called Kahramanmaraş. This is one of my favorites because the city of Kahramanmaraş is the city of ice cream. So I had never been there before, but as a kid and as a tourist, if you ever visit Turkey, you will have Kahramanmaraş ice cream. It's the sticky thing that they do tricks with. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful city. And that mural was unfortunately the fence of the school building that we just saw. Before I went on the field, I got a lot of supportive phone calls from colleagues who had done this type of work before, and they offered me emotional support. And a lot of people asked me, like, how are you holding up? It's because you're seeing so much devastation on the field. To be honest, day after day of seeing this level of devastation, it really didn't do much to me. Until I saw this picture while sitting in my comfortable office in California. This is the before, and that's the after. When we were on the field, we were looking at a parking lot of rubble. Oh no, those used to be buildings where people were living in, they were working in these buildings, they had their businesses, they had their children in these buildings, and 6 days later, it was a pile of rubble. Similarly, this is the before picture of the business district, just one block over from where I just showed you, and this is after. When we're doing structural design, one of the concepts we talk a lot about is, life safety, collapse prevention. We want the buildings to still stand up. In this case, you lost everyone on your block. Do you want your building again? Yeah, so we really have to think about the entire community. So that's one of my biggest takeaways as well, is that you cannot just be designing your one building. Because if you lose your neighbors, if you lose your stores, you lose your schools, then you lose your community. So we have to think about that. So City of Kahramanmaraş was quite damaged. They had 15,000 collapsed buildings. Collapsed buildings means casualties and injuries. And what do those people need? Hospitals. So we went and visited 4 hospitals. So these 2 are actually within the city. And just outside the city, they were actually consolidating the healthcare system. So the one on the top is an older building, so it's still it was still in function, it's still in service, but the ultimate goal is to pull them all out of the city. So let's visit that one first. This is a hospital where we visited, and the director came out. We chatted with him, and he said, oh yeah, first earthquake, we got rattled a little bit, but we went back in because people needed us, right? They had lines out the door, they helped people. And then after the second earthquake, 9 hours later, even the staff said, no way, I don't want to go inside. Luckily, a structural engineering professor from Ankara came down right away, walked the building and said, you're safe, you're good to go, you can use the building. So after a short delay of half a day, they were able to reopen. So this older building in the middle of the city was functioning just fine, and all their generators kicked in. They just didn't have gas heat, so they were using electric heaters, and the weather was actually not that bad. Well, sometimes. So all of their systems functioned, and they were able to serve. This hospital that was in the middle of the city, again, super close to that rubbled area with the business district and the apartments, this private hospital had major damage. And then on the outskirts, we visited the new hospital that was under construction. So they were building it with base isolation because since 2017, you're required to build hospitals with base isolation. So this was under construction at the time, and nothing moved. Well, there was not much to move, but even the scaffolding that they had was not damaged. Right next to this new hospital was the other new hospital, only built 12 years ago. And this is day 10, and this is a hospital with 300 bed capacity. So it's meant to be the major hospital of the region. And it was closed. We walked the building. There was one wing, just past the red arch there in the back, there was one wing right in the staircase. There was the one column that was showing damage. You could easily rope that off. You could use the other remaining 2 wings. But you cannot use them if your ceilings have fallen, there's rubble, there's dust, there's dirt, and you don't have electric power because they had a fire in their electrical closet. You cannot do operations if you don't have clean air. So 10 days in, and they could not function. Even worse, we walked up to see their water tank, and they have a giant water tank where they keep water for, for emergencies. But this water tank sloshed and hit that column and then hit the wall in the back, and all the water poured out and the valve pulled out. So you go through all of this work to build this emergency tank, but if your connections are not flexible, then you lose all your water. What is a hospital if you can't provide hygiene? Because they lost water from the main system, happens, but if you don't have backup water, again, you cannot serve your patients. So day 10, they were serving the community out of military tents. This was 10 days after the earthquake. 6 weeks after the earthquake, the ERI one of the ERI teams was dedicated to looking at hospitals, and they visited 35 hospitals. Out of the 35, half of them were not functioning. But according to the detailed reports that we saw, only about 5 of them have true structural damage. The rest of them are closed to the community because of the non-structural damage. So what we're learning from this one is that, again, just because your building is, the shell of your building is well built, it doesn't mean that you can provide the service you need. You have to think about these ceilings and the water pipes and the electric power that is necessary for you to be able to provide the function that you need. Now we're going more south towards Antakya. The shaking was extremely high in this region, and I'm sure there's many posters and talks about it in the conference that I'll be visiting tomorrow. I want to share with you what it's like being on the field. So this is me, and my colleague is doing it on the other side, just putting my phone up on the window of the car as we're driving along one block. On the outskirts, and we said, oh, look at these apartment buildings. These look good, and it's only a couple blocks away. And then I found the damage assessment database for the street. So these are the official damage assessments done by the government with engineering professors and students. And all of those tall, pretty upscale looking apartment buildings were marked severely damaged. And once I found that, then I went through my pictures and I found, oh yes, look at this person. They didn't feel safe in the building. They didn't feel safe to leave the building. They probably couldn't leave the building via the stairs because probably rubble fell. So they had to make a makeshift ladder for themselves and jump out of the third floor window. Again, Antakya has a lot of history, and that's something that also really suffered in this earthquake. We're staying in Hatay for a little bit. So this is, again, a beautiful city with thousands of years of history. And this is a quote from Anton Andonov, who was on the EFIT team. So EFIT is a European organization that also has field teams. And he says, Hatay had its bones broken in pieces because the major hospitals collapsed, or there's one major hospital that collapsed. And more importantly, they had no water for 5 days, they didn't have communication, they didn't have power, so they felt alone in the dark. Further, the fire station, this is the people you turn to. These are the people who are supposed to come rescue you. the fire station fell on top of the fire trucks. The lives of the firemen were saved because they were in the trucks. But again, this is really important equipment that they needed to have with them so they can immediately respond to Hatay. Any good stories? I got one. There was one seismic retrofit that we were able to visit in Antakya. And this is a set of 3 apartment buildings built in the 80s. And back in 2000, there was a research project that had the funding to retrofit. And of these buildings, block A3 is on the right, and in the front of the photo, that's the rubble. That building received no retrofits. The one behind it, block A1, actually had retrofits of fiber reinforced wrapping around the columns, and they also added shear walls, about 8 of them, on the outside of this 10-story building. The other one, block A1, kind of got retrofit a little, it got retrofitted, but a little lower level. So as you can see, the one with no retrofit was reduced to rubble. The other 2 with retrofit were actually, the occupants were able to exit safely. It's kind of interesting because now I'm finding out that this, when I was visiting, this became a really important thing in the news. They were talking about, oh, just wrapping the columns, saves your building. Nobody was mentioning these big fat walls they also had to have. But turns out they actually demolished this building. This would have been a really good reminder to keep up there and show people seismic retrofits actually save lives. Because there's unfortunately a very limited number of them in Turkey right now. So these are pictures of the reinforced wraps and those shear walls on the outside. Oh, okay. Again, just to kind of lighten the mood up a little bit, they do have retrofits in Turkey. Most of them are actually part of this program that the World Bank started in Turkey 16 years ago. And they've been able to successfully retrofit 1,000 school buildings in Istanbul. So it's definitely possible to retrofit these buildings, but one of the perceptions that we have to think about is that people want new. And we'll have to talk about that when we get to the recovery section about what does it mean if we have to replace all of the buildings in your neighborhood with new buildings? What happens to the fabric of the culture and the community that you used to have? Okay, back to Taiwan. So just a reminder that they learned from the earthquake, changed their behavior, and saw success. Let's talk a little bit about the Turkish earthquake code. So this is back to Kahramanmaraş in that parking lot. There's rubble most of the place as far as the eye can see. And there's one building. This is the building, this is the chamber of the civil engineers. So similar to our ASCE over here. And actually, it's really ugly though. I mean, I do have to admit that. But and one block behind it is actually the Chamber of Architects. Also, their building was shiny, bright red, and standing up. Turkey has, just like the US, so in this part, we're pretty even, has an evolution of the building code. So the first building code came in place in 1975. So all the buildings before it, and that picture you see is actually where my parents live. That's a 1966 reinforced concrete apartment building in Istanbul. So all the buildings before it were built without a code. Okay. And then over years, you're kind of learning or working together with everybody else in the seismic design industry. The Turkish codes also evolved. And the 2018 version of the code, which is the most recent version, is huge. It's 416 pages, 17 chapters. It's very much alike ASCE 41, which we use in the US. Sidebar, it's really hard to use. And so the code is in place. This is a really interesting study I found where the researchers are comparing the requirements in the seismic code. Again, it's an evolution, it happens. But a really simple example is the use of deformed bars. So if you've ever seen a rebar, it's a steel bar and it's got like a spiral around it, right? So it can't simply pull out. But in Turkey, until the 2007 code, you were able to use non-deformed bars, which they call soft bars in Turkey. In the 1999 earthquake, we saw this everywhere. They would just pull through. Because another thing you have to do is you have to put a hook at the end of it, and if you don't put that 135-degree hook properly, again, with those earthquake forces, the bars can just simply pull through. So the requirements changed. And another thing that they're covering here is that these stirrups you put, so you have your steel cage, and then you have to wrap your column around with more steel. And what they're showing here is that distance between the stirrups also shrank, which is a good thing, right? So you get to put more. So as you can see here, after 2000, the number of stirrups you have to put is a lot more. So you have to put more steel into your columns. Let's now recall that when we looked at the typical damage we saw in post-2000 buildings, a lot of it was due to not enough reinforcement. So the rules are in place, but the application of them is lacking. I thought this was a very interesting case study as well to show how the evolution of codes really has an impact. This is a hospital campus that the ERI team found, where they have 3 buildings. The older building is damaged, red mark, so you cannot use it. The building from 2005 is evacuated, which means it's damaged. It's not safe to be in it in case there's an aftershock, but people were likely able to get out. And the building that was built in 2020, it's steel, which is actually kind of rare in Turkey, but that building was able to function. And in this case, they also make the note saying it was able to provide shelter. Yeah, so just a reminder of the post-2000 buildings here. So again, where are things going wrong? This is a article from the New York Times. And they have some very interesting anecdotes that they quote in here, which again, my colleagues in Istanbul shared with me as well, that in Turkey, you do not need a certificate to practice engineering, or it's not difficult to get a certificate to practice engineering. And inspections are also quite limited. So what they're quoting here is that they actually have an inspection program for your construction, but for many years, the construction company was able to select the inspection company. So they actually they actually corrected that. So now it's assigned inspectors that you get. But there's again like a 5 to 10 year window where construction companies were able to pick their own inspectors. So let's talk about who's designing these buildings. Turkey is geographically not a very big country, but it's pretty dense, 80 million people. But there are 127 civil engineering departments. That is a lot of civil engineering departments. And every graduate out of a 4-year program gets a certificate to design 3 buildings a year. In the US, you have to study your BS, and then you have to get your master's. You don't have to get a master's, but that's a little bit of a shortcut. And then you have to work for 3 years under a professional engineer, and then you have to take an exam, and once you pass that, you can get your license. And in many states, you actually have to continually take continuing education units to be able to keep up your certification. In Turkey, once you have your graduation diploma from university number 127, you get to build 3 buildings a year. And the more you build, the higher your quota gets, and you can build bigger things. So what tools do they have? One of the things I've been told is that there's a lot of use of software packages, because of course you want to do these buildings cheaply and efficiently. So they're using software packages. You just put in the architectural model, it spits out where you put your walls. And here I want to quote Ashraf Habibullah's caricatures here. He's the person who owns SSA. So this is the company that makes basically all of the modeling software we use in structural engineering. And he has a cartoon series to teach us, but mostly children, about structural engineering. And one of his best-selling tools that every structural engineering office in the US uses is called SAP 2000. And here, he's talking with his advisor, Professor Wilson, and he's asking Professor Wilson, why is it called SAP? And Professor Wilson says, the slang name SAP was selected to remind the user that this program, like all programs, lacks intelligence. It's the responsibility of the engineer to idealize the structure correctly and assume responsibility for the results. So it's not about, oh, I just push some buttons and the computer tells me what I'm going to do. No, you still have to use your engineering intuition to design a building properly. So who's responsible? The term in Turkey for a developer is müteahhit, which is it's a word that has a meaning of the person who takes responsibility. So they actually take responsibility in this case. There are 450,000 registered müteahhits in 2019, and they love putting their names on the buildings. After this earthquake, I think they might stop that. And this is, again, from the New York Times. They found this guy, well, they found this picture, and this golden scissors are actually the largest golden scissors in the world, according to Guinness World Records. Good for them. And the guy in the middle with the bow tie and the awesome jacket, he claims he has never worked on this building. He's never seen this building. Yet he's the one holding the golden scissors. So he's the müteahhit. And immediately after the earthquake, there was a big news about them arresting a lot of these müteahhits. But arresting 200 out of 450,000 isn't really going to make the change. Again, this is not the organizational change we need, right? It's not about punishment, but it's about changing what people are asking for. We need people to ask for better buildings. What now? So just to go back, Kahramanmaraş and Hatay, these are the two cities we looked at a little bit. So just to underline some, in Turkey, a lot of the buildings are multi-use. So these cities, you wouldn't really see a downtown with commercial only. So whenever we say buildings, 90% of the time, we're talking about a building that has some kind of residential in it. So it might be residential with some offices, but we're still talking about people's homes. So for a population of 1.2 million, about 60% of the buildings had some kind of damage. And I used to show this slide with the percentages for severely damaged or collapsed buildings. But what's actually happening is that people are afraid to go into their buildings with any damage, or any type of moderate visible damage. People are afraid to go into them, and they're not, they're requesting shelter. So what this means is that in this earthquake, in this region of 14 million people, housing for 2.7 million people was affected in one day. That's 3 million people on the streets in the middle of February, and there was snow. So it's a humanitarian disaster. So immediately after the earthquake, of course, there was a big migration out of the earthquake area into the other cities. So about 1 million are shown in this plot. And about a month later, this is kind of how I was trying to capturing, was that the education department was talking about, yay, we placed 100,000 students in other cities. And about 3 months later, about 30,000 had returned. Of course, the challenge, again, even when people return to their homes, what's there for them? What kind of school is available? I already mentioned that school buildings weren't so much damaged. That's a good thing. But in that case, these schools are now used for shelter because 2.7 million people don't have homes. So this is a school, even though there's a school building, they have to teach out of a tent. So a lot of people were placed in tents right away, and then a lot of container cities were built. 15 months later, there's still about 700,000 people living in containers. And these containers are, I think, according to the EFIT report, they're 226 square foot. They describe it as this wide for a family. And also, once the people were placed in these in container shelters. They also had big rainstorms and flooding. So we, of course, don't want to keep people in their containers for too long. Let's talk a little bit about insurance. This is where Turkey really differs from California, at least. They have really good earthquake penetration because since the 1999 earthquake, there's mandatory earthquake insurance. You cannot get your water connected or your power connected unless you have earthquake insurance. So 60% of the people in the earthquake region had insurance. And according to the organization, they have received 620,000 claims, and they're able to pay this back. So there's a lot of rebuilding going on. The good news here is that they're not rebuilding the same way. They're rebuilding in a type of structure that is called tunnel form construction. And this was actually this was primarily used for affordable housing projects in Turkey. So even in the earthquake area, a lot of those buildings that were built by the Affordable Housing Authority, they were either not damaged or just moderately damaged. The only downside is that they are much more cell-like. They have a lot of walls, which we engineers love, but from a lifestyle perspective, they're probably not as fun to live in. And there's a promise to build 850,000 units. It looks like the progress is not as fast as hoped on this rebuild, but the goal is to give people their homes back. So rebuilding continues. This is that downtown area I was showing earlier. It's now been demolished, so then it looks really empty, right? You take the rubble out, you take the sadness out, but now you're left with rubble. And there are beautiful city planning projects that are showing us a beautiful future when they rebuild. And I think we will see if we can actually get there. So with that, I want to close my talk. But again, my main focus here is we need to learn from these earthquakes scientifically, technically, but also think about the bigger picture. It's not just about what type of rebar to use, what type of structure you use, but it's about what does a community need after a disaster? Like what happens to the community after a disaster? So I think this really opened my eyes to thinking beyond that one building, thinking about the services it provides, thinking about the electric and the power that the hospital needs. So all of these are really going to make me change my practice, and I hope that it will really impact your work going forward as well. Thank you. Okay, I think we have some time for questions. So we have some microphones in the halls, or these alleyways.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. Is this going? All right. I was involved in the Ridgecrest earthquake response, and in that case, there were 2 hospitals. There was a new wing, or maybe it was 1 hospital, I forget. There was a new wing, at least, and in that case, it was the coupling to a water tank failed, and that was on the roof, and so they basically couldn't use the entire new wing of the hospital because water damage contributed to other problems. And similarly, ceilings fell and all that kind of thing. So I'm an earthquake geologist. I'm just wondering if there's any initiatives in the engineering community to make the non-structural components sexy. Because it feels like in many ways, we know what to do, but sort of the last mile is still challenged. So I'm just curious if there's a need to work on that.
Absolutely, thank you. We certainly have rules and regulations and knowledge for making and thinking about non-structural components. Unfortunately, I don't think we've thought about how to really market it, right? That if you have a hospital, you do have to have certain types of connections that would prevent that type of stuff, that type of damage to happen. But it is so easily overlooked. And for anything that is not a hospital, those requirements are really not even there. And just to hopefully make advocates out of all of you, one of the places we're actually really trying to push this is schools. Because in schools, classrooms are full of maybe not water tanks, but there's bookshelves and aquariums and all these things that can actually fall on the kids and block exits. So that's one area that my organization is working with the California Office of Emergency Services, where we're putting out a lot of these easy to do projects for school administrators and parents to go bolt that bookshelf to the wall. So those are also non-structural components, right? So there are simple and easy things that can be done, and even that would make a huge difference.
James Bila, the PGA underestimations on the 1999 Global Seismic Hazard Program maps at the epicenters of the two February 6 earthquakes were by 2.0 to 3.8 for the magnitude 7.8 quake 27 kilometers east of Nurjaji, and they were by 2.2 to 3.5 times more for the 7.5 earthquake 4 kilometers southeast of Kinazu. And this added another couple of cases of still more PSHA tragic surprises to the, since the year 2000, now approaching 1 million fatalities, where exceedances on seismic hazard maps were 2 to 4 times what the public was led to believe. Maybe you could comment on how Taiwan turned things around.
Okay. My understanding from Taiwan, and again, I am not an expert in Taiwanese building codes or construction, but according to the news reports I have read, it is about building code enforcement. One thing I have learned about, for example, Chile, is that they have a lot of earthquakes, and because of that, the public actually demands stronger buildings. So you can enforce things from the top, but I think if you have demand from the public, the market for it, then you can actually achieve better resilience.
Yeah, Ayşe, thank you very much for this very important presentation. Martin May here, Editor-in-Chief for BSSA. I think you remind us eloquently that earthquakes don't kill people, but buildings do, and in particular, incorrectly built buildings or buildings subjected to corruption. I want to share a short story and then ask a question. The short story is that as being a resident in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, during the earthquake, I was actually woken up at night by press calling me to get a response on what happened in Turkey. And 2 weeks after this event, I was essentially continuously on some media in Qatar and Emirates and Turkish media, different TV stations, newspapers, and so on. And there were two different kinds of questions, responses from the Turkish media in particular. There were those who cared and who asked the question of what happened and why the damage and so on. And you try to speak, to explain. And the local reporters essentially, I mean, I had 2 or 3 cases, I'm not exaggerating it, they broke down sobbing when I explained what I knew from an earthquake standpoint. And then there were the other side of the reporters who tried to coax my response into a specific direction to release the government from responsibility, saying, look, this was an inevitable earthquake. It was God-given. We couldn't do anything. It's not our fault. And I have to say, as a scientist, this was a very, very difficult situation because you feel exposed to this breadth of human reaction at this very, very moment of the tragedy. And I think some of our colleagues here shared similar experience, that you'd get asked to give a response, a scientific, a technical response to this tragedy, and you feel at some point helpless, and you can just focus on the facts at this very moment. So I think there's also a learning experience for us from a scientific point of view, to understand how to communicate better. What happened in that situation, and to prepare, the broad population for such future events which inevitably will happen. And that leads to my question. How is Turkey preparing for the next one in the Marmara Sea that has to come? The central part of the Marmara Sea hasn't broken since, 66 or something like this. It's ready to go. Istanbul is right there. So is the Turkish government, the Turkish decision makers, are they learning now and putting things in place for the inevitable earthquake that will happen and most likely affect Istanbul very strongly?
Great question, thank you. As I mentioned, earthquakes are personal. I already showed you where my parents live, right? 1966 concrete building. So this is very, very important to me and all of us in Turkey. So Istanbul, there's the research community and the technical community in Turkey is very sophisticated, and they absolutely understand the risk, and they've been trying to communicate the risk since the 1999 earthquake, and of course before it, but since, after the 1999 earthquake, they've been really focusing on Istanbul. And I am sad to share that their voice is sometimes heard and sometimes not. Government decision makers are interested sometimes, safety, elect me, and then they don't care so much. What I have observed is that, what I've learned is that there is about 200,000 seismically vulnerable buildings for this, what they call a deterministic earthquake, right? So it's coming, we know the buildings are bad, we know the shaking is gonna be bad, and there's gonna be a huge devastation in Istanbul. There is a big campaign for urban regeneration in Istanbul, but the problem is so huge, and the solution they've come up with is replacement. And I have to argue that you cannot replace 300,000 buildings. You can't move all those people out, build a building. Things happen fast in Turkey, but you can't do it 300,000 times before that earthquake comes. So I actually have some initiatives. We have a project in Turkey right now where we're trying to think about ways to make retrofits sexy. Because there are cases where you could strengthen these buildings just so that you can get these people out of there alive. And my take is that we have to do both, right? We have to retrofit, we have to replace. So there's a lot of worry. There is some talk about wanting to do something. There is no money. That's the main stalling point. But I think if we can make more options available, such as retrofits that are affordable, they can actually get to a safer city faster.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much for the talk. Just love that so much. So I'm an assistant professor at civil engineering at Tsinghua University. So I'm currently joining a digital twin hazard scenario reconstruction project. So I'm just wondering, so if Turkey have the plan for have a digital replica of the cities, to have a kind of digital twin cities, which can do the hazard preparing and planning and everything. At least people have a digital replica of the real buildings, so people know all the information of the building, and that people can prepare for the future bigger earthquakes or other hazards.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a great approach. And just like the previous commenter said, communication to the public is the really important part, right? So if some people need to be communicated in this is what's going to happen if you don't do anything, let's do that. We just have to think about many different options to get to the ultimate goal we want to get to. So I think that work can definitely help.
Yeah. So is there any platforms the government prepared for that, or plan to have platforms to just have a digital twin preparation for the hazard mitigation?
I think data is always the limiting factor for this type of work. So yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I don't know if they have the inventory. They don't actually have the inventory data that you might need for that level. But yeah, we're trying. Yeah, there are efforts trying to do that in the SF Bay area as well, and I find that inventory is where we usually stall.
Yeah. By the way, my advisor Nafi Toxos is Turkish. He was professor at MIT, and we just celebrated his 90th birthday. Yeah, so he's a lifetime member of SSA. So yeah, he was sad because for the last year the earthquakes destroyed his hometown. So yeah, so in his birthday party last month at MIT, I told him I will have a digital replica of the Hatay, his hometown. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question?
One more question, yes.
Okay. So Ayşe, I'm curious about your observations on the damage that came from the buildings with the amnesty program and the TCIP.
So, just to explain, and then I don't know how they would actually relate. So, amnesty program is that in Turkey, unfortunately, one of the typical practices is that you get a permit for a building to build it up to 5 stories, and then you just add another one. And you just add 6 or 7, just 2 stories above it, and then they say, oh no, don't do that, and then you wait for an amnesty. And when the amnesty comes, all your sins are forgiven. So that certainly had an effect on buildings, but I haven't seen any studies about it actually, so I'll clarify that. But what that would do is that you design this building to support 5 stories, and now you added 2 more above it. So of course that's going to cause some vulnerabilities.
So that was basically competing with the newer constructions that we saw the damage or even collapse coming from not enough enforcement on the building code, right? So they were kind of competing forces in Turkey that you have observed, or?
Can you clarify that?
Yeah, for example, there are buildings that come from the amnesty program, and then there are buildings that are newer, but they still see the collapse and damage, which shouldn't happen if you have enough reinforcement, right? So what % of the damaged buildings were coming from amnesty program versus, not reinforcing enough of the building code? I think that's what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I have not seen anyone study that.
Okay.
Yeah, so, sorry.
Thank you.
One short question,
yes.
maybe?
All right, thank you. So one thing is to design the buildings, and second is to monitor and study them. Was there an initiative in Turkey to install seismic monitoring devices or sensors in new construction, just to study them before and after and during? And if yes, who is going to collect the data and monitor and be responsible for this? Because that's, in Los Angeles, that's a very sensitive question, for example, but how is it done in Turkey?
So the seismic monitoring of buildings has all of a sudden become a really popular topic after the earthquake. I think there's a lot of smaller companies, trying to get the interest of building owners to monitor them. So I don't think I don't know of a systematic program of seismic monitoring. I know that there's people in this room who know a lot about seismic monitoring, of the fault in Turkey. But for buildings, I'm not aware of a proper, network that does that. And
Okay, thank you very much for that sobering but very informative kickoff to our meeting. And thanks to Kinemetrics for the reception downstairs a few minutes ago. And with that, we'll wrap up with another round of applause here, and I will see you all tomorrow morning for the start of our technical sessions.